Orange Pill. Orange Pill. Orange Pill.
It's Michael Krieger. Max, you originally called him the poet laureate of the debt apocalypse.
Oh, right. So Michael Krieger, one of those rare thinkers and writers that combines brilliant prose with brilliant insight, right? So those two usually don't go together, and that's why he's been such a popular writer on various outlets over the years. And, it's taken him to, I think, a new place in his life as well, out in Colorado. So I was anxious to catch up on things.
Hey, Michael Krieger, welcome to Orange Pill.
Hey, Max. Hey, Stacy. It's an honor to be on your new podcast. Very excited to have this conversation. Thanks for having me, and appreciate that introduction, Max.
Right. So, we have a lot of questions about localism, Bitcoin, and social media and all the censorship going on there. But first, I want to provide that context of, you being the poet laureate of the debt apocalypse. It's kind of upon us right now, this end of the U.S. empire that we see in the IMF this week called for a new Bretton Woods. This seems pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that I have realized over the past 10 years of public writing is that change like this takes a lot longer than you think it's going to take. So for example, you two were talking about issues that I wasn't even aware of, before I started writing publicly, and then I sort of learned about the world around me, the reality of how things work, and spent a lot of time learning about it. And so I think there's this tendency, once you sort of discover a lot of the lies of the system, let's say, and want something else, you assume that just because you discovered it, everyone's going to discover it right away because it's so obvious now. But the truth of the matter is it's a process, and there are waves of people. There's waves of, let's say, discovery. There's waves of consciousness evolution for humans. There's all sorts of stuff like this where it takes time. And I realized that just because you discover a truth doesn't mean that your neighbor's going to discover the truth. Certainly not on the time frame that you might want it to happen. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting that I feel lucky. When I first moved to Colorado 10 years ago, it's going to be 10 years this December. I figured, things would be happening way quicker than they were. But, I caught a lucky break because these last 10 years have allowed me to establish roots and learn a lot of skills and be very comfortable where I'm at, as opposed to what you see now, which is a lot of people panicking to get out of New York City. They're sort of, bidding up houses. And so, I was lucky in that sense. So, I like to say, I sort of see things too far ahead of time. And I think you guys are probably in the same boat. And that can be a blessing and a curse. It can be a curse sometimes because you expect things to happen quicker, but ultimately I think it's a blessing because it gives you space to prepare. But yeah, I think a lot of the trends that we, the three of us have been discussing and forecasting for years are now coming to a head and becoming undeniable.
Right. So let's focus on this move that you made out of the city into Colorado. And you were ahead of the curve, as you point out. And now we've got a situation where, because of COVID, there's been a reveal that the economy is very fragile, more fragile than people had anticipated. The central banks are printing like crazy to try to paper it all over. And you've got social cohesion risk, as they call it over there at The Economist magazine. You've got a lot of outbreaks of violence around the country. So is this, how do you position that? Some people call it the fourth turning. That's part of a guy who wrote a book called The Fourth Turning. Is it, or I know historically you look at markets going back hundreds of years because there's many cycles in play here. So on the Michael Krieger kind of historical timeline, where are we? Are we pre-revolutionary? Is it the fourth turning? Is it the Kinderhoff cycle, which is a 60-year cycle? Where are we?
Right. So that's a great question. I think all of the above would be my answer. When I was younger, learning history for the first time, American history, even some world history as well, as they intertwine, I noticed early on, it was very little that wait a minute, there seems to be like a certain amount of years that pass between revolution, civil war, World War II. I found that interesting, and it sort of demonstrated that there are cycles to the human condition that a lot of people like to ignore. But then Howe and Strauss in The Fourth Turning put that into like a book, sort of the Bible of the cycle, called The Fourth Turning. And as soon as I read that, I was like, okay, well, yeah, this makes perfect sense. I'd thought about it before, but they really put a lot more meat on the bones to it. So I jumped to that right away. But the longer I go, the more I see bigger cycles even. There could be, that could be just like there's smaller cycles in, let's say, the stock market or Bitcoin. There's clearly cycles we see around the halvening. There are cycles to other things that are even bigger than this, that are even bigger than the Fourth Turning cycle, which is around an 80-year generational cycle. I mean, there are probably 250-year cycles, 500-year cycles, 1,000-year cycles. And so what cycle are we in? I tend to think, without being able to prove any of this, that we're at a moment where a lot of cycles are coming together. And I think the generational cycle, or the Fourth Turning cycle, that Howe and Strauss discuss in brilliant detail, is actually a small cycle potentially in what we're looking at. And when you think about stuff like Bitcoin and the internet and all these things that have happened post World War II, it makes me feel like this is bigger than just those typical 80-year cycles. I mean, we really are potentially launching into a new era for humanity that is actually probably inconceivable to most at this point, including myself. But I feel it. I feel that optimism beyond, let's say, 5 or 10 years.
Actually, Michael, you were the first to ever tell us about the Fourth Turning. I remember on Kaiser Report a few years ago, and you were the first to kind of popularize it in this whole, orange pilled space. So how does that whole unfold? But also, what sort of signs do you see in particular this election cycle and the social media and the censorship happening? Like, it seems chaotic and crazy, but is there a way to make sense of it that makes it all seem obvious?
Okay, so again, this is my opinion, and it's an optimistic one, right? I mean, ultimately, it's an optimistic one, and the way I see it is, so we were talking about cycles before. Is human consciousness, right? First of all, is that real? Like, can you evolve consciousness? I believe you can. I mean, we talked about spiral dynamics on your show, a couple years ago. And if human consciousness can evolve, and it can evolve amongst masses of people. How does that change things, right? To me, that's a fundamental change that we can't even, contemplate easily. It's so dramatic. That would be the most dramatic change if we can do that over the next few years. That's possible. Now, of course, right? When it comes to something like that, like someone's consciousness level starting to resonate at a higher level, it's almost always the result of some sort of pain, some sort of difficulty, some sort of realization that you didn't want to face previously. And so I think that's what the next 5 years are about, or maybe more, but at least probably around that amount of years, where people that have wanted to deny what's going on, how we've been tricked, how we're manipulated, how we're socially engineered, all of these things sort of have to face that reality. And you can respond to that in a number of different ways, right? You can just develop Trump derangement syndrome, or you could be, all alt-right and angry or whatever. I mean, you hateful rights, punch down, punch sideways instead of punching up, stuff like that. But I hold out hope, right? Because we do still have reasonably free communications amongst each other globally. Again, never has happened in the history of mankind. As much as the tech giants are trying to stop it, this is just there's no point of reference to human beings, the 7 billion of us, being able to talk to each other online in real time. It's just, we can't even contemplate what that's going to lead to. And so, Bitcoin is another example. Again, something that's never been possible before, that's possible now and thriving and growing. So to me, as more people get on that train, as more people sort of awaken, you're going to have people devolving, right? We see that now. On all sides of the political spectrum. I tweeted yesterday that, we aren't even, mainstream political people aren't even debating ideas anymore. They're just calling each other foreign agents. But right. And as depressing as that can be, they get a lot of, let's say, play on social media. I do feel like there's this growing grassroots minority, very small minority, but it's growing fast, of people that are saying, that's not for me. That's not how I'm going to respond to this. As bad as things are, I'm not going to lower myself, right, to acting like a complete lunatic and fool. As Ben Hunt, wrote in one of his pieces, he explained it, turning into a rhinoceros, right? I mean, this is what happens in times like this. People turn into rhinoceroses and they just start trampling everything and making a mess. But don't do that, right? Let's not do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you bring up a good point, is that the mainstream media, the fourth estate is supposed to, help the people not only hold power to account, but also try to explain what's happening in the economy, in the politics, geopolitics around them. And so, like when I started the top of the show, our interview here is like the fact that the IMF is calling for new Bretton Woods. This will be so much more profound impact on the United States than whether Biden or Trump win, actually. And yet it wasn't mentioned at all. Nobody in the US media mentioned it. We did. And of course, that will just be dismissed as, propaganda for mentioning this, that the IMF itself gave a press conference saying this. So, I mean, if we lose our exorbitant privilege while we're fighting over, is Hunter Biden more corrupt than Eric Trump? What do you have to say about this?
Well, exactly right. And I didn't mention this, but I shut down my website in July, and I was thinking already about moving on to something different. But when I saw the environment, the political environment, when Sanders was sabotaged again, it just became very clear that the normal channels of changing things are just not functioning and aren't going to function, right, until we sort of hit a brick wall. So I felt like I had said everything that I needed to say on a lot of these topics, at least in blog form. I mean, I still tweet about it. And then I needed to refocus on, how do I respond personally? What can I do? What's interesting out there, as you say, what can we cheer on? What can we promote? Because there's a lot, actually. It just doesn't get the airtime. And so what I hope and what I think is that as things get worse, right, as things deteriorate further, what's interesting about this election is, my opinion, no matter who wins, right, you're gonna continue to see decay. You're gonna continue to see oligarchs steal everything. You're gonna continue to see the national security state clamp down on any sort of dissent, whether it's right or left or middle. You're going to see more restrictions on speech on these tech giant platforms. You're going to see more of that, right? You're going to see that it doesn't matter. And so my hope and belief is that as it becomes undeniable, increasingly undeniable, and as people lose faith in the traditional system that we're told, right? This is what you see everywhere from everything. Vote, you got to vote. That's all you hear, right? I mean, it's the laziest form of political activism there is to vote. I think that an a large number of people are going to gravitate towards truly revolutionary things. And as I tweeted a couple of days ago, the only two political movements that have some sort of gravitas right now that I find interesting are actually Bitcoin and localism. They're different, but they're similar in some ways as well. So that's, I think more people are going to gravitate towards actual action, right? Direct action, as opposed to something so lazy as voting.
Right. Yeah. So to pick up on these themes here, I got a quote from Paul Tudor Jones, which I will tell the exact quote in a second. But basically what he's saying here, and he's interviewed on a big mainstream media outlet this week, he was saying that he is getting into the camp of pro-inflation. So he's buying gold. He's essentially shorting bonds. And he's looking at Bitcoin. He's got a Bitcoin position. And then he went on to say that it's very rare to see something like Bitcoin, because when you're shorting bonds, it's a bet against humanity. But when you're buying Bitcoin, it's a bet pro-humanity. And he said he's hardly ever seen that, or never seen that before. The exact quote goes, quote, "I've never seen a store of value where you also have such great intellectual capital behind it. When you short the bond market as an inflation hedge, you're really betting on the fallacy of mankind rather than its ingenuity, like you are with Bitcoin." Your thoughts?
Yeah. So one of the most, it's interesting, right? And it demonstrates his intelligence that he's able to, pick up on that. which of course I agree with. One of the common threads that I've noticed amongst people in Bitcoin, whenever I mention it, a lot of people say, "Oh, me too." The same thing happened to me. Is that pre me discovering Bitcoin and getting into it, learning about it in mid 2012, I was in a sort of a dark hole, right? In the sense that I felt that if the trends that I saw coming were going to end up in the place that I believed they would, I would own some gold, I would own some silver, I would be prepared, relatively speaking. But it was a gloomy outlook, right? I mean, it was hard to come to a conclusion that, okay, well, everything's going to collapse and you're going to have your gold and silver and be okay, but what's left? What's going on around us? It's sort of like a negative reset. And so once I learned about Bitcoin, I immediately grasped the idea that, oh, this is a positive reset potential. And before that, I could not see an outcome. Let's say economically, financially, for the financial system, that was a positive one. But once Bitcoin came around and I learned about it and I understood it, I saw the positive reset potential. And that was it. I mean, ever since that point, I've had an overall optimistic viewpoint on the future of humanity. And as I mentioned the last time we talked, I think there's more to come, and I think we don't even know about it, but I have this feeling all sorts of stuff is going on as we speak under the surface level, not Bitcoin related, not even financial system related, that could change the world in ways we can't imagine. And, one thing I tweeted about is this idea of energy. And if you could, because right now when you put solar panels on, generally speaking, you're tying into the grid. You're not really off grid at all. You're not producing your own electricity and then storing it to use. But that really fundamentally for me would be a huge change. If people could actually produce energy on site for themselves at a reasonably low cost, whereas most people could do it and not have to be tied into a grid. And I sort of feel like hopefully we're getting to that point. But just think about what that would allow. It would really allow you to live more remotely. It would open up a lot of potential for people. To be, again, this is just more decentralization, localism ideas. We need, interestingly enough, right, localism, when you hear localism, you think, oh, you're just retreating into like these tribes. But actually, for localism to thrive in the way that I want it to, you need technology to allow you to live more locally or more remote and more connected, because people want to be connected. You don't want to just sit in a log cabin in the middle of nowhere off grid and just wait for something bad to happen. That's not fun.
Well, I mean, we talk to Abe Cambridge all the time. He posts a video in Orange Pill episodes, almost every episode. And we talk about the Solarpunk is what it's called. It's like cypherpunk, cyberpunk, solarpunk. And this is the sort of decentralized future where you're more self-reliant and anti-fragile. So, when we're talking about this positive Bitcoin future versus the whole negative future imagined by the bond and gold investors, I mean, that's all we've had since the last Bretton Woods. And then in 1971, when we went off the gold standard. I just find it interesting that if you look at the leadership in our country, whether it's Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or all of these guys, they've been around since like 1971. They've been in power since we handed them ultimate power of fiat currency. And now they're at the end game of that. And you see what they're doing. Their instinct is censorship, shutting down, not letting you hear news at all. Like the story about the New York Post is just remarkable, right? That shows a deep contempt for the ordinary American, that they can't handle the truth, that they can't handle this sort of information. And, on the other side, we have this Bitcoin community, which is like anywhere you go, at any conference, anywhere in the world, you meet people from dozens and dozens and dozens of different countries, and we're all united in this self-sufficiency, in self-reliance, in anti-fragility, and in like a sort of Bitcoin nationality. Like this is our sense of being. You just need one Satoshi, and nobody knows who owns 10 Satoshis or 10,000 Satoshis. 10,000 Bitcoin. So how do you see this playing out? Like, Paul Tudor Jones saying that this is the positive step. Do you see just more people looking like, instead of voting, like you have the choice, Biden or Trump, it's the most important election in your lifetime, or is the election just exit that system and go long Bitcoin?
Okay, right. So this is something I've written about quite a bit, and I think again, I like to say Bitcoin is a teacher as well, because so many of the attributes that are inherent in the protocol are what I believe form a framework for applying to other things. That doesn't mean with a currency right here in the same way, but just philosophically. And one of those things is voluntarism, right? Bitcoin came around, it was nothing. Some people started mining it, some people started promoting it, people started learning about it. And now here we are 10 years later, where people like, Jamie Dimon and his bank, JP Morgan and PayPal, right, who were huge skeptics originally, are now forced to change. And how were they forced to change? It wasn't through legislation. It wasn't through anything other than Bitcoin just working for 10 years, right? I mean, that's all it's done. It's just continued to create blocks and exist and function. And it changes, it changed the biggest bank in America. It's changed PayPal. It's incredible what that's done. All voluntary. Right? It's all just people deciding, this is interesting. This is something I want to be on board with. This is revolutionary. And so I think a lot about governance and citizenship and nationality in that sense. And the unfortunate thing is people are just born into a piece of dirt, and they're pretty much 99% of us are going to live on that piece of dirt forever under rules that they never agreed to. Okay. Now, I like the Constitution of the United States, even though we don't follow it. I happen to think the Bill of Rights was a brilliant and worked for so long. Republican form of government plus democracy, all that stuff. I like it, right? I happen to like it. We don't follow it anymore, but I like it, the concept. But what if you don't like what you're born into? You're sort of just stuck. Okay. And so is that ethical? Why are we living like this? Does it make sense? And so what I want to do is I want people to think about that more. And this is, I started writing about this with the Catalonia thing, and the idea that, Spain says you can't leave, right? You're locked in forever. So if you say that to a province, it's not a voluntary association at all. It's some sort of bondage. And it gives you, the only out there is some sort of revolution. I mean, you have no other choice. So, I really think that if we can get into people's heads the idea that it is unethical to bind people to rules or documents that they fundamentally don't agree with or never agreed to at all, we can start to think about that in a different way. How do you do this? And one of the things I said, actually, of all the only flaw I think in the Constitution, it allows for secession. But what I would have done is I would have said every 25 years or so, I mean, we can debate the amount of the time span, but every 25 years or so, the state automatically has a vote on whether they want to remain in the union. Okay, so it's like this regular thing where you're constantly, affirming, I want to be part of this union. It still works for me. And, ironically, I actually think that would reduce the odds of secession or splintering because there's leverage. Okay, right now, you don't have any leverage. The person has no leverage. The state, even the state body, has little leverage. Okay, they're really under the thumb of the national government. You see in Catalonia again. You see it here even. So if let's say, these apparatchiks in DC understood that every state was going to have some sort of a vote every 25 years, they would be more hesitant to do some of the things they're doing because there's always that out. There's that automatic process to, and again, I don't think it should be like a 51% to 49% thing. I mean, we can debate that. Should it be 60? Should it be 65? The threshold should probably be high to break away from a union. But I think we need more voluntary unions. If we're going to have nation states, okay, which who knows, right, where we're going. But let's assume we live in a world of nation states still in the next 100 years. They need to be more voluntary. They need to be more fluid. We need to have more say in the types of governments we live under. Just like Bitcoin allows us to have a say in the sort of monetary savings that we engage in. So that's sort of how I see things. It's beyond Bitcoin. Bitcoin is phenomenal, but it's much. This can be much bigger than just that.
Right. So to follow up on a couple of things there. Well, first of all, in the United States, you do have a state, Wyoming, that is almost seceding from everybody else using Bitcoin, and they're setting up their own legislation and their own governance based more on Bitcoin. So that's kind of interesting. But when you say we are now able to live more remotely, another way to phrase that is we are now able to live closer to nature. And that's something that you write about and tweet about often. We've seen your photos of various vegetables and other flora and fauna from your garden. And, you know, you're taking a lot from that. You're closer to nature, and you're writing about how this is, you know, made you, I guess it's fed your soul in a way that couldn't be otherwise fed. And another thing you were mentioning about, you said we ignore the cycles. There are cycles, but we ignore the cycles. So to tie this all together, I mean, there have been civilizations that were understanding of what the penalty is to ignore cycles. And I'm thinking about the Greek theater and the idea of tragedy, right? The tragedy in the Greek theater is people ignore cycles. They ignore what's blindingly obvious. They choose to ignore, and they walk into a tragedy. So this has been dealt with already 2,500, 2,600 years ago. And finally, my round off my point here, if you're in nature and you are now in sync with these cycles and you're not fighting them tragically, do we get into this concept of a hive mind? Because, you know, in nature, there are many hive minds. You know, trees, we now know, are constantly communicating with each other in many ways through the subterranean root system and through other ways. The symbiotic relationship between bees and pollen, between all these things going on. These are all hive minds. You know, bees are not out there waking up at 9 a.m., grabbing a cup of coffee and go out to get some nectar. They're working on some underlying fundamental instinct. So are we, by cutting ourselves off from the nation state and by adopting Bitcoin, are we now going to subsume into a more natural state of a hive mind, which is a more natural expression of who we are, Michael Krieger?
Right. So yeah, and I think again, this goes back to the global consciousness idea. You know, are we becoming more conscious as a people? I mean, Terence McKenna had this idea of the global brain. He talked about that. I mean, his thoughts on the internet, it's fascinating. I mean, he died in the 90s, but you know, the internet was coming up, and his descriptions of the internet, you know, in the very nascent stages was just so on point about what, you know, what it really meant. And I still believe that, even with this big tech censorship. I don't think this is gonna, you know, last forever. You know, I think the global brain wants to form. You know, humanity wants to evolve its consciousness. We want to go to the next level. I really think that's the case, and we have the technology that allows us to do it. Because if we're not connecting globally, it's hard to create that, right? I mean, you're not talking to other people across the world, and so Bitcoin has already created that global beehive, you know, in that way. But we can do it in other things too. There's no reason. Well, we don't need elites lording over us and telling us what we can do, and we can sort things out. You know, Bitcoin. People would have bet against it because they thought, no, you can't sort this out. You need a central authority. You need someone to make the rules. But you don't. Turns out you don't, right? And look at again, like I said, JP Morgan and PayPal are being bent to the will of Bitcoin, not the other way around, which is what a lot of people expected. And so things may turn out more positively than people think over time. Again, next 5 years, dicey, but beyond that. And so the nature thing is important. And you know, my new website, when I do launch it probably will be next year at some point. I mean, I have to feel like it's time and I'm ready to do it. But yeah, some of the topics are going to be about nature. And, you know, I have this one post already that I'm going to write, which is about like why everyone should have a garden. And one of the reasons is, as you mentioned, it puts you in very close sync with cycles and things outside of your control. So I think humans like to think one of two ways, binary. Okay, there's nothing I can do, right? These are my circumstances. It's terrible. I'm screwed, right? And then there's the other people who think that I am all powerful. I will bend the world to my will. I can do whatever I want, and outside circumstances don't matter. The truth is, it's a mix of both. And gardening, more than anything else that I've really experienced, throws that in your face every single day, because it is so important that you know what you're doing, that you prepare, that you work really, really hard at it, and you learn over time. But it's equally important that, you know, some crazy weather event's going to come and kick your butt. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about that. So there's this sort of balance between what you put into it and then the external circumstances. But the key lesson, all right, from gardening is not, I made a mistake, my biggest mistake ever, actually, in the last 3 weeks. I left some of my warm weather plants out when I saw the forecast would be 30 degrees. I had hundreds of tomatoes, 25 peppers, months of work wiped out, just completely wiped out. It was my mistake. It was also weather, but it was my error, because in September, I was able to survive a freeze perfectly fine. And so I got overconfident. And so my garden got wiped out. I mean, the summer stuff got wiped out. It was very depressing. But guess what? I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that. And so it goes to show that it was the best garden I've ever had. But because I wasn't quite thinking, and the weather just hit me out of nowhere, it got wiped out. So again, this is what I think people need to understand. There's cycles, but at the end of the day, you got to do the best you can. Definitely try.
Right. I want to follow up on this tomato wipeout story, actually. I think there's some interesting things to dig in here. Because you and I both share a Wall Street background, and that's kind of how we bonded initially, is that we were critical of a lot that goes on in Wall Street. And, you were writing great exposés about this. But, on Wall Street, and you were an analyst on Wall Street, if you miss an estimate for the quarter and the stock drops 10, 15% one day, you get, quote, wiped out. And within 5 minutes, you've completely forgotten about it. Versus, okay, you've got a crop of tomatoes. You misanalyze the weather. You got your food stores wiped out, and it hurts. It hurts you deeply. There's a big difference here. So there's a whole generation now that's been brought up on Wall Street, that's been brought up on financialization, that's been brought up on stock markets, that's has swapped human values for financial values. And that is the dominant valuation. Donald Trump, he'll say, vote for me because the stock market's at all-time highs, right? That's probably the first time a president led with that as his rallying cry. It's not a chicken in every pot, although it is a variation on the chicken in every pot, but obviously chickens are a lot closer to the farm than the S&P 500 and your 401k, right? So I guess my question is, do you see that where the values that you were learning on Wall Street ultimately did not prove worthwhile to feed your soul, and were not life lessons that really meant anything, Michael?
Yeah. So one of the things I realized, growing up in Manhattan, I did have some exposure outside of that, of course, but, growing up there, I never questioned, what that lifestyle really meant and how it compared to, let's say, the lifestyle I have now. But after I moved here, I really became in clear focus. In Manhattan especially, right, a very dense city with tall buildings, you're essentially disconnected from nature all the time. You maybe see a star here and there, the moon here and there, the sunset here and there, but you're very disconnected from the natural cycle of things and just the beauty inherent in it, right? I mean, and that disconnection is really sort of a 20th, 21st century phenomenon. I mean, with light pollution and all that stuff, our ancestors were very connected for every single period in humanity prior to, let's say, electricity and the megalopolis. Were connected to nature and the cycles of nature constantly. Now, that didn't stop them from messing things up, but I do think it hurts the soul. And the more time I've spent in nature since I've been in Colorado, the more I realize I love it, and the more I realize it just makes me inherently happier. It provides this peace to me that allows me to just be a little bit less, I don't know, like sociopathic, let's say, because if you think about it, right, the lifestyle in Manhattan, and I lived it, okay, and I know how pernicious it is. It's because you're disconnected from nature, what it becomes is just becomes a human on human game. So every single day, it's just like you wake up and you're competing against other humans and you're trying to get more of, in the case of New York, mostly people are chasing money, trying to get more of that and competing in various roles to get more of that or to increase your social stature, right? So you can go to better restaurants, or you can get, let into the better clubs, whatever it is. It's just this human on human competition. And there's nothing wrong with human on human competition that's healthy, but I think we've taken it to such an extreme. Well, I know we've taken it to such an extreme now, where the idea of cooperation, voluntary cooperation, is like crazy to most people. They don't even think about it because they're just so in their own head of, I got to get mine, and it doesn't matter what sort of impact I have on anyone else around me or society at large. I'm just going to go get it. And, I think if people spent more time in nature, to be quite frank, I think you'd lose that drive. I don't think you'd have it. I think it calms you down. I think it puts things in perspective. I think it just makes you actually a better and happier person. That's what I've found, at least. But to your point about like tomatoes versus Wall Street analysts, it's interesting because what actually did attract me to Wall Street in the beginning was that it felt like actually every day, if you're a trader and you're an investor, every day you're being sort of judged, right? Are you right? Are you wrong? Do you lose money if you're wrong? You make money if you're right. And what made me so disgusted, amongst other things, about the bailouts in 28, 29, which made me leave Wall Street, is that I realized that was fake. It wasn't true. When Wall Street loses, they win. It doesn't matter. They get bailed out. You can't lose. So all of these, like Bill Ackman, people like that are just these nasty Wall Street people who, just go on CNBC and cry when they lose some money, and then of course get bailed out by the sugar daddy Fed. It just exposed that whole thing to me as like a fake game that I couldn't get any satisfaction out of anymore. Because I had believed, that it really was this giant global poker game where you were playing against people based on, your ability to analyze stuff. But it turns out the only thing you need to analyze is the Fed. So it just lost all interest to me. And, that's why I'm here now. And, and the garden is a real test though. There's no central bank to bail your tomatoes out.
That's very well put. But as you were talking, I was thinking of transcendentalism, which is an American philosophy that formed in the mid 1800s, and Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and of course Henry David Thoreau. You sound like you're a modern on Walden Pond out there. But I mean, I think that kind of fits in with this whole Bitcoin movement that has erupted, which is a Neotranscendentalism of self-reliance, of the belief in the goodness of man and nature, and that the simplicity of it. I mean, there's this whole meme going around that, you don't need chairs. Chairs are luxuries because like you could buy a few Satoshis for the chair instead. Like why buy a chair? And that's very neo-transcendentalism. I kind of feel like do you look at old philosophies like the Transcendentalists or like the Enlightenment thinkers or like the Renaissance art? Like are these something that inform you today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I haven't read Emerson in a while, but I do remember when I did, he was just my favorite. I remember thinking like, oh, I'm really connecting this. And this is when I was, a New York City guy, totally not exposed to nature really at all. But I always connected with, Emerson and Thoreau, but even in particular, Emerson. So I completely understand what you're saying. They don't inform me, let's say now, because I'm not reading them now. I probably should read them again. But yeah, I mean, I always naturally connected with that sort of outlook and philosophy. And I do think we can have a new Renaissance, right? But I mean, the key message to me is like, the thing that we're being told to do is vote is the last thing that's going to lead to a new Renaissance. If we're going to have a new Renaissance, it's going to be a couple. First of all, at the base level, it's going to take as many people as possible creating a Renaissance in their own mind, right? In their own actions and their own individual circumstances. And then if enough people do that, of course, some of those people are going to happen to be really talented like Satoshi, right? Extraordinarily gifted people. And so if they can combine the consciousness plus that natural gift, think about what it can serve the world, right? I mean, we're going to, so it's important, right? A lot of people will say, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. Well, it does matter because, even though you might not be Satoshi, you could be Satoshi in your own little world. And so if enough people do that, we can get there. And so I actually do also, I'm very encouraged by, I knew it was time to stop my website when I stopped listening to like the kinds of interviews that I had been listening to. And I noticed, wait a minute, I'm just listening to homesteading videos. That's all I was listening to. It was like 24/7. I was just like, listening to all these people like homesteading in Idaho or Alaska, because I wanted to hear about these skills that were connecting to the sort of lifestyle that I'm trying to move more towards in my own life. And, I knew something was happening with me. A change was happening, a bigger change than I already had. And so I think though, this isn't just me though. I think we're in the early stages of a back to nature trend. And so you mentioned like transcendentalism and this idea. I mean, I think we're heading, towards a sort of era of that, over the next few years. And I think that's a good thing. And I think, a lot of people say, okay, people moved out because of COVID. People are leaving big cities because of COVID. New York, San Francisco, the obvious examples. Clearly true, okay? But is there something else going on there? Is there a certain amount of people that already had the inclination that, I sort of had one foot out the door in New York or one foot out the door San Francisco already. And then this was just the final straw. And I'm out of here. I sort of feel like that's happening too. And so we're on the precipice of a back to land, back to nature, not in a I'm doing this because I'm afraid of the apocalypse sort of way, but I'm doing this because I want to feed my soul kind of way. And I encourage it. I've been encouraging it for years. If you live in a big city, if any of what I'm saying is connected to you, get out, just get out, do something else. Smaller cities are amazing. Okay, I live in a smaller city, happen to live in a really, a particularly really interesting one, but there's so many. I mean, I love small cities. I love small towns. Okay, and then hopefully we get more technology that allows living in those small towns, plus connectivity and energy, self-reliance, stuff like that, makes it all easier. But yeah, I'm a big proponent of that.
All right. Well, that's a great point to end on a very positive note, except for, if you go raise your tomatoes, remember the Fed can't bail out your tomato catastrophes.
Right. Well, Tomato Gate. It's the biggest scandal happening in Colorado right now. The entire crop was wiped out. Who is responsible? We need to dig deeper into this.
We might need a GoFundMe in the Bitcoin community.
Yeah.
Just send me tomatoes.
Yeah. Send more tomatoes.
I have no sauce.